Welcome to KC Cares, Kansas City's nonprofit voice. We're telling the stories of Kansas City nonprofits and the people behind them. I'm Ruth Baum-Biggis. KC Cares is proudly sponsored by the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation. Well, we've been living with COVID-19, and it has been hard on so many people in so many ways over this past year. Nonprofit organizations have been front and center in helping us weather this storm, and now many may be paying the price. The Center for Disaster Philanthropy and Candid released a study recently saying more than 1/3 of U.S. nonprofits are in jeopardy of closing. What can these organizations do to stave this off from happening? Well, our guest today can provide some great insight and guidance. And joining us is David Oliver. Hi, David.
Hi, Ruth.
It's so great to have you back.
Thanks for having me back.
David is an attorney. David is an expert on board and governance, and he's formed a new think tank called PLX, Plan, Lead, Execute. You've had a lot going on in a pandemic. I am so impressed.
Well, trying to help the not-for-profit sector. And, Ruth, you're right. These are challenging times. And so happy to share any insights I might have with folks on how to navigate through this.
So we've been living in this altered world thrown upon us for more at a year, but looks like it's going to continue in some form or fashion for a while. Can you share with us a little bit what you have heard and been dealing with in the governance sector?
Yeah. So I'll talk about my consulting clients, and that's non-legal work. That's really governance work and board management relations. When the lockdown began, a lot of boards were faced with a real challenge. If they were providing services face-to-face, couldn't do that anymore. Management and the boards had to figure out how to pivot in that respect. In addition, if their fundraising was primarily a big event, lunch, dinner, whatever, couldn't have those, so their revenue was impacted. Many of them then had to figure out there was the ability of PPP loans. I don't think most board members, and I don't think a lot of management ever thought that they would be trying to access these type of loans, which were very chaotic the way the government rolled them out, in all honesty, and the rules kept changing. So this caused, and then you ladle on top of that the fact that the board couldn't meet in person. I've been talking recently, now that we've been doing this type of communication from our homes virtually, to try to separate what caused us to go virtual and try to see the benefits to your organization from this type of virtual connection. So last night I led a planning session for an organization that we're going to be doing some board work for the year. One of the board members is down in Wichita. So it was a huge benefit to be able to do that virtually. On the flip side of that, he says, hey, it's great. If I'm in Wichita, he's the only non-Kansas City board member on the board. I don't, in all honesty, want to drive monthly to Kansas City for a board meeting. And so my ability to hook up virtually is very beneficial. So there's some pluses in this. But the other thing I'm seeing is that, well, one, every board member had to figure out a whole bunch of technology. Some of them weren't used to that. We're all figuring out what are good social platforms to connect with. I am seeing it. I am seeing those, for example, Zoom and others are trying to figure out more creative ways to make it look like it is more in person. And so there's some benefits here, but no kidding, this has been hard. Now, your statistic of 1/3 are at risk of going out of business. I've been urging boards to think through, what is your sustainability plan? Because these are challenging times and you do need to do a stress test. I'm also encouraging boards and management to think through what were the pre-existing conditions that you may have had that had you kind of, on the edge, if you will, and the pandemic puts you over the edge, you may have to have a hard conversation. Should we stay in business? Should we look to merge with somebody or form some sort of alliance? So again, I'm trying to convert it from, everything's going to hell in a handbasket, to say this is a time of creativity that you ought to take advantage of.
Well, as you know, pre-pandemic, Kansas City has roughly 8,000 plus nonprofits. I think it goes up to even to 11,000 if you have all the faith-based.
Yes.
With your crystal ball and working in governance, which also deals with finance, do you have any projections?
Well,
starting to come out. So
yeah, I do think there are those that are going to find themselves unable to continue for a variety of reasons, and I hope that they will be very strategic in their thinking. Look out for others that they might align with. So again, this is an opportunity. The merger word, and I get it, mergers cause a lot of people to get hives. Because sometimes, in the for-profit world, mergers mean reduction in headcount. Mergers mean you're not going to have two CEOs, you're not going to have two CFOs, and that's the reality. But where I'm trying to have not-for-profits think things through would there be a way that some like-minded not-for-profits could come together, and maybe they have some shared back office services? Maybe they can't afford a full-time CFO, but if 5 like-minded came together and that CFO could work on the 5 organizations' books, there's something creative there. Same with office space. I will say that I think a lot of not-for-profits are having to look, the for-profit world is having to look at how much space do we need on an ongoing basis. I do think this plays to the benefit of not-for-profits because tenants, I think the playing field has been leveled between landlords and tenants right now, because I think a lot of people are figuring out we don't need as much space as we need. And so I think this is an opportunity for a not-for-profit, if their lease is coming to an end or they are thinking about renegotiating their lease, they really should look very closely at that. And this is an opportunity for them to reduce some overhead at this time now. But, Ruth, I want to mention another thing. Yeah, we have a lot of not-for-profits. There are a lot of people who are wanting to start not-for-profits now. I am really urging them. It's the same with a startup for a for-profit, in all honesty. This is really hard work. It's very hard to do. Even harder right now because foundations have diverted a lot of funding into COVID relief. And how long that continues is up for grabs, in all honesty. But I think that a board of a startup really needs to think hard. Should we come into existence? I also think Kansas City, our region, is so geographically large that there are not-for-profits. I'm being generic here, but there's a not-for-profit in Southern Overland Park that may be doing exactly the same thing as a not-for-profit that's up near Liberty. They don't know about each other. I think we need to be spending some time trying to get to know each other, see the overlap, do some ecology analysis of, hey, do we have 16 not-for-profits who are doing about the same thing? And work cooperatively there. I actually think the funding community would appreciate that type of analysis. They don't want to force anything on not-for-profits to merge, but I think they do want them to be thinking very creatively and strategically.
boy, that's a really hard thing to do. If you're an existing nonprofit and you need to start talking about going out of business, or merging. From a governance side, how do you deal with that?
Well, I handled, I represented, again, not legally. This because luckily they had a law firm, and law firms in Kansas City are willing to do some of this type of merger work on a very discounted or even pro bono basis. Because from a legal standpoint, effectuating a merger is pretty mechanical and not that hard to do. Where it gets hard is figuring out if the two cultures of the organization really are compatible. But I ended up advising a very small not-for-profit that was realizing, hey, it is increasingly, this is pre-pandemic, okay, but it still applies, increasingly hard for us to raise money for a variety of reasons. Increasingly hard just to even be out there in the social media. You know, it's wonderful all the way we can communicate, but there is so much out there. Trying to create that type of buzz or recognition is hard. There was a larger organization that said, hey, we would like you to join us. We will keep what you're doing alive. The larger organization did more than that. I fully understood that the board members of the smaller organization were very concerned about mission. They wanted to make certain that what they did would survive. So we spent a lot of time having the boards getting to know each other, really figuring out what is the cultural alignment, will it work? Because I think sometimes people don't spend that time to figure out, can we work together? They just mush the two organizations together, and then they realize, ooh, they behave a lot differently than we do. So this was a success because we took the time to get to know each other. And I'm pleased to say that this has worked because one of the board members from the smaller organization ended up going on the bigger board. Some of that was to give the assurance that that person would, advocate for this particular program of the larger organization. So it does work, but you just have to be slow. I don't want to say slow. You have to be persistent, okay? And you have to make certain that all your board understands what's going on. We did at the 11th hour have an issue where a board member who had not participated as much as they should, they came for the final vote. And I'm not saying they were trying to derail it, all right? But they had a lot of questions that if they had participated for the previous, 4 or 5 months, those would have been answered. And so at the 11th, and again, I'm not saying they were trying to be disruptive or do anything wrong. They were trying to do the right thing. I also do, I say this not to scare not-for-profits, but, if you don't do it right, Missouri's Attorney General will look at it and might get involved if you don't do it right. So you do need to be meticulous in how you do these things.
You bring up one of the top issues that in doing research for our conversation comes up, the top board governance problems and getting to know one another.
Yes.
How key is that? And what's the best way to go about that? Especially when you have busy people.
Yeah, I think it's essential. That's where this type of virtual meeting can help. And again, ironically, last night, I was working with 3 board members in a planning session to do a year's worth of work with a larger board, about 15, to get them to understand the type of organization that they are the board of. Okay. Again, I'm going to be generic, but these are folks who were asked to be on the board, said yes, never got any onboarding, and they don't know each other. So I worked with the 3. It's a task force, happens to be the board chair, the board vice chair, and the newest board member who is a seasoned board member. And by seasoned, he's been on other boards and he knows the ropes. Okay. I know him. He's a very good board member. So I did an exercise with them about, okay, what motivated you to join the board? And what do your board members need to know about you to allow you to work well with each other? And how familiar are you with the mission of the organization? Now, it helps if you've got an outsider like me guiding that conversation. Because I'm comfortable if, some people don't like sharing about themselves, and I'm not trying to force it, but I am saying to them that there is literature, both business literature and academic literature, that says boards in general, if they know each other, behave better and help the organization. So if you set it up that way where, okay, and people love to talk about themselves, and then you begin to realize, oh, that's what motivated this person to do it. There's some passion there. And so then you're kind of building passion, because after all, these are volunteer appointments. They do take time. Some of the issues can be very challenging sometimes financially. And we got a really good conversation going. And so I think it's essential that the board gets to know each other. I also think it's essential as boards are seeking to diversify, it's very important to understand when you're bringing a more diverse group of people to the board who don't know each other, and you just throw them into the mix, it's going to be really tough. I'll give you a concrete example. I agreed to be board chair of a startup, and I thought it would be an interesting experience to be board chair of a 13-person board, and I only knew one other person. It turned out to be much more challenging than I realized, and I had to slow down and really pull out of each board member what their motivation was, because I want to be generic here. And it's interesting because the startup, the founder was very good at setting this up, picked an outstanding board. So from a skill set standpoint, the board was outstanding, but we had no idea how each one of us would react to certain circumstances. And there was a policy that we had to adhere to as a board, where I suddenly realized trying to find that line between what we can do and what we can't do became very challenging. Now, some of that is, boards should set policy. Boards don't run an organization on a day-to-day basis. And boards have one employee, the CEO, and the CEO runs the place. And so, you got to talk about that, because some people think, oh, I run the place as a board member, and maybe even I run the place individually, and my job as a board chair is to make certain that the board, when it acts as a unit. Now, I try to build consensus. That's just me, rather than have a vote, because I'm smart enough to realize if you've got a 5-4 vote, let's say you pass something 5-4, then hey, I don't think you've done enough work to make this work long term, So communication's key. Sorry, I'm going on too long, but communication's key.
No, I think this is great information for nonprofits to know and take the time. I'm wondering what your viewpoint has been. Has the pandemic given us permission to take that time, or the reverse?
Well, it's kind of a catch-22, because the quick changes that needed to be put in place when the lockdown occurred required a board to meet more often than they normally meet, make decisions. Well, I use the PPP as an example. The rules kept changing, but the board had to authorize it. Some people were worried about, well, how do we repay? Can we repay? What do we do? Is it going to be forgiven? Management could not give clear answers because the rules kept changing. And so you had to spend time talking about the issue, making certain that everybody had enough information to cast an intelligent vote. And so you couldn't spend time getting to know each other, okay? But that can produce some fractures, because one person may think, I'm not doing this no matter what, because either they don't have enough information or their risk tolerance is not the same as everybody else's. So that produced a lot of friction in the system early on. But then as it began to slow down, as far as the decision making, then I think boards realized we do need to get to know each other, and they need to get to know management, okay? And in this circumstance, they not only needed to get to know the CEO better, but they needed to see the CEO's management team if they had a team. Now, some smaller organizations only have one person in management, but those that I advise, so the management team had to perform as a unit as well. Now, I'm working with one not-for-profit that I'm very complimentary of them, because they are doing culture work within the staff, in which the staff is really doing some guided work with an outside consulting company to build what the real culture of the organization is. I think it's worked out. I think this organization might have let the board know that this was going on sooner than management did. But now they're bringing the board in to learn about it, and it's an interactive. And so that's a very good discussion going on. And the board has decided to make time for that. And so that's important. I do think another thing we just have to be honest about, people, and I'm guilty of this sometimes, you get on these Zoom calls, and if they go too long, you start looking at your other devices and you start multitasking. And I hear this from management. Hey, what do I do, David? I can tell my board's not paying attention. Okay. So I think any meeting that goes longer than an hour is counterproductive, in all honesty, especially if you're talking about a whole bunch of things.
Then how do you govern when there is so much on a plate, not only in day-to-day operations, but then you throw something like a pandemic on top of it?
Yeah. Well, here's what I'm recommending. So I think the board chair and the CEO should have, I'm going to throw out, they can figure out if it's weekly or every other week, but I think the board chair and the CEO should have a call at least every other week on where things are. They can then, I also think if the board has an executive committee, maybe you have the executive committee and the CEO meet to plan the agenda and to talk through, okay, yeah, this issue is going to come up. It's going to take more time. Let's not jam too much into the agenda, and do some real strategic planning as far as that's concerned. I'll give you an example, and I'll name names. Okay, so I'm board chair at MRI Global. We have a fairly small board. We're a very large and very complex not-for-profit. I meet almost weekly with the CEO for a whole bunch of reasons, because there are a lot of things going on. That we have now, the executive committee rarely meets, but now we've decided, and the executive committee is made up of the committee chairs. We only have 3 committees, but we have decided, okay, we're going to meet with the CEO to plot the agenda, because we only meet 4 times a year. By the way, I think a lot of boards meet too often under the assumption that meeting often makes for a better organization, and I don't think that's necessarily true. We can talk about that, but we meet 4 times a year, and we have a day of committee meetings, 3 committees, and then the board meets the next day. But we've decided that the executive committee, because we don't want to overlap. The other thing that's just a killer, especially when you're doing it virtually, is let's say you have a finance committee and the finance committee's done its entire job, and then you regurgitate everything that the finance committee did at the board meeting. I mean, that's just a waste of time. I call it filibustering the finances. Okay. And now the finance committee needs to dig into it. Okay. And if there are red flags that the whole board needs to know about, bring that up at the board meeting. If not, I'm really urging folks, it makes them nervous, but if you work at it and you do it right, I think the finance committee report and approval of the finances, if the organization's working well, that ought to be on a consent agenda and get that out of the way beforehand. Now, that requires board members to read their board packet. If they've got any questions about the finances and they're not on the finance committee, call the finance committee chair, ask your questions there. Don't blindside people at the full board meeting with a question. And don't just ask a question to try to impress, okay? Ask a question because you're helping the organization. But what I'm trying to do is get committee work not to overlap the board work. And that's the other function we're doing now with the executive committee, that if there is some meaty issue, MEATY issue, that the full board needs to deal with, let's flag that and we will spend more time. But what we're trying to do is get the necessary work that, the law requires a board to do out of the way in a board meeting and spend most of your board meeting talking about strategy, forward-looking strategy. Are we meeting the goals that we've set for the organization? Do we have sustainable funding in the short, mid, and long term? Are we serving the mission of the organization? And not have the board meeting be a retrospective of what happened during the past either month or quarter, a look back. Have a board meeting being a look forward where you're really strategically engaging board members in leading the organization from a policy standpoint.
We have just a couple of minutes left.
Sure.
I wanted you to just quickly tell us about PLX.
Sure.
And how people can find you.
Yeah, PLX. PLX, there are two of us, Gary Abram and I, we're the same age. This is a passion project for us. We do think of ourselves as a think tank. I actually wish I'd met Gary a long time ago. We both say that. And he's a serial entrepreneur, both for-profit and not-for-profit. We have very similar interests. And we do think of ourselves as a think tank, that if a not-for-profit is stuck in some respect, they can't quite figure out why they're not achieving what they want to achieve, come to us. We ask a lot of questions. Give you an example. If the organization is having trouble raising money, Gary and I know enough because we've served on enough boards what makes fundraising effective. But we don't want to become fundraisers for the organization. We would put them in touch with folks. We're building relationships with other companies that are trying to help the not-for-profit sector. And so we've got a relationship with a company that does know how to raise money very creatively. And they have a lot of different ways to do it and to be supportive of not-for-profits. So we refer them to them. We do go through, and what I've just said, as you and I have been talking, we're trying to get people to say, this is what I need to learn to be an effective board member. There's lots of literature out there. This is not, in a sense, this is not rocket science. Okay, that's a trite phrase, but people just need to be onboarded. They need to understand what their responsibilities are. People want to make our community better, and board service is a wonderful manifestation of that. But it's not a hobby, okay? It's a responsibility. And so getting yourself educated as to what it means to be a board member can actually be very interesting and then very liberating as far as, hey, I want to make this organization succeed. I want it to fulfill its mission.
You can learn more about the work David is doing with his partner and helping nonprofits really get themselves in a good space, governance and board-wise. It's plxcorp.com. David, we could talk for hours. I hope you'll come back and we'll continue to explore the really important issues that all our organizations face. We want to thank you for listening to KC Cares, Kansas City's nonprofit voice, produced by Charitable Communications, and we're proudly sponsored by the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation. To be a guest on KC Cares or underwriting opportunities, visit our website, kccaresonline.org, and you can spread the love and find us on Facebook and Twitter at KC Cares Radio and on Instagram at KC Cares Online. And catch us on ESPN 1510 AM and 94.5 FM Saturday mornings at 8 a.m. Thank you for listening to KC Cares.